Hi, this is Kay with Girl Meets Meeple, and today we'll be learning to play the 1 to 5 player game Terror Below. At its heart, Terror Below is a pick up and deliver game where you'll be grabbing giant sandworm eggs and dropping them off while avoiding the rampaging worms. Or perhaps you'd prefer to hunt the worms for big rewards. Either way, let's make some noise, attract some worms, and get right into setting up the game. To start, place the game board in the center of the table. We will be using the front side of the board in this setup. The reverse side includes a canyon variant, which we will cover at the end of the video. Next, find the location tiles. These are the government facility, the state police, the motel, the general store, and the hospital. These tiles are placed on the board at the locations with the bull skulls. For a randomized setup, you may instead roll the coordinate dice to place locations. Next, separate and shuffle the bounty, weapon, item, character, and vehicle decks. 4 bounty cards are placed face up in the indicated row at the top of the board, with the remaining deck placed nearby. Weapon, item, and vehicle decks are placed near the board in easy reach. Place the supplies of rubble, eggs, and victory point tokens near the board. Separate the 4 black bordered starting worms. You will need to resolve worm attacks for each of these worms. To do this, you will locate the coordinates listed on the card. These are found on the top right of the card. The blue number indicates the row and the red the column. Place an egg of the indicated color on the listed coordinates. Egg color matches the color of the triangle at the top of the card. Then, look at the attack pattern on the card and place 1 rubble in each spot indicated by the shaded pattern. Only 2 rubble pieces may be placed in any one tile, and no rubble or eggs may be placed on a location tile. After the 4 black bordered worm attacks are resolved, you will draw and resolve 1 additional worm attack in a 3-player game, 2 additional attacks in a 4-player game, and 3 additional attacks in a 5-player game. We will be setting up a 3-player game today, so we'll draw and resolve 1 additional attack. Once all attacks are resolved, you will draw 3 new worms to place in the terror zone under the 1, 2, and 3 spot. The matching target token is placed on the board in the spot of that worm's starting coordinates. Now each player chooses a vehicle pawn, draws 1 weapon, 1 item card, and 3 vehicle cards. Each player is then dealt 3 character cards. The remaining character cards are removed from the game. Each player chooses 1 character to be their active leader and places the remaining 2 underneath the leader for later. The starting player is the person who most recently defeated a worm in combat, or just choose randomly. Then, starting with the last player and going in reverse order, vehicle pawns are placed on a location. Players may not choose the same starting location as another player. And that's the setup. Now it should be noted that it's the character cards that give each player their asymmetrical benefits and abilities. So when you're choosing your player pawn, don't worry about which one you have, or if your friend has a tank and you have a station wagon, because they are just pawns that mark your location and they have no abilities of their own. We are now ready to begin playing the game. The goal of the game is to be the first player to collect 20 victory points. Victory points can be gathered through a number of different ways, the most profitable being through the bounty cards. Bounties can be delivering eggs or hunting worms, and these are worth anywhere from 2 to 6 points depending on the particular bounty. You can also earn 1 victory point for killing any worm on the board, even if there isn't a bounty, or for dropping off any egg to any location. But you can't collect both a victory point and a bounty on the same action. You can also earn victory points from some item and weapon cards, as well as from being a daredevil and jumping the canyon on the variant side of the board. Now that you know the goal of the game, as well as how to earn victory points, let's look at the specifics of how turns break down. In step 1, players play vehicle cards. When a player plays a vehicle card, they place it in the terror zone under one of the 3 active worms. Each worm has a card limit listed, and if that number is met or exceeded, the worm will attack at the end of the turn, so pick wisely. Every vehicle card includes a number of action points. It might also include a distraction and a special ability. The distraction, if available, is resolved first. To do this, the target marker of the worm the card was placed under is moved as indicated by the arrows in the order listed. Next, the player performs actions based on the number of action points on the card played. These points can be used to move one space orthogonally per point spent. Players may not move into a space with rubble or another player's pawn, but players may use a point to ramp, also known as jump, another player pawn. You may jump to any empty space orthogonally adjacent to the vehicle you're jumping, but the new space must not contain rubble. So, the blue car ramping over the tank to the space directly above it or to the space to the right would be a legal move that costs only one action point, but the blue car could not ramp and land to the left of the tank because of the rubble, nor could it land in any diagonally adjacent spaces. You may also use action points to pick up rubble in an orthogonally adjacent space. 1 point per rubble cleared. This rubble is placed on your leader card. If a player collects 3 pieces of rubble, they must immediately discard them and draw either a weapon or an item card. You may also use an action point to deliver an egg to a location. Dropping off eggs also garners a delivery bonus along with a victory point bounty, depending on the location. Dropping off at the general store earns the player an item card. The motel earns a victory point token in addition to the first victory point or bounty. The police station earns a weapon card. The hospital allows the player to return one of their dead characters to the game, placing them under their current leader. And the government building allows the player to take a secret bounty, which is drawn off the top of the stack or taken from the visible bounty row and placed face down in front of that player. They are the only player who can fulfill that bounty. And lastly, you may use an action point to pick up all eggs in your current location. This action will end your turn as no more actions can be performed after eggs are picked up. The sedan card gives the player 4 action points. In this example, the player would choose to collect 1 piece of rubble that is blocking her path, move 2 spaces, and then for her final action, she will collect the egg she landed on. After you have used your action points, you then check for special abilities on your vehicle card and resolve them. The sedan card has the special ability, move any target token 2 spaces. As she is currently in the line of attack, blue will decide to move target token 2 by 2 spaces. In step 3, you refill your hand to your 3 vehicle limit. The final step of your turn, you will check for worm attacks. A worm will attack any time the number of vehicle cards under them in the terror zone meets or exceeds the number listed on the starburst on the bottom of their card. If a worm attacks, first check for face-down cards in their terror zone. Flip them and resolve their distraction arrows. Next, the worm drops an egg of their listed color on the spot where their marker is currently located. The worm then drops a rubble piece around them as indicated by the shaded spots on their attack grid. If a player is caught in the attack grid, they will have to battle the worm. Multiple players may be caught in a worm's attack. To defeat the worm, damage equal to or greater than the worm's health must be delivered. The worm's health can be found inside the heart icon on its card. If enough damage is dealt to defeat the worm, the triumphant player collects a victory point or a bounty. If the player cannot deal enough damage, their current leader dies and drops any rubble and eggs on their card into the spot on the board where they battled and removes their pawn from the board. If the player has any remaining characters in their stack, the next face-up one becomes the new leader, the player gaining any listed benefits. On their next turn, they can place their pawn on any location on the board to begin their turn. If a player's final character is killed, this will eliminate them from the game and trigger one of the 2 in-game conditions. We'll talk more about that later. It is possible for more than one player to be caught in a worm's attack. In that case, the player who played last will play the first weapon card. Then each player who is engaged with the worm in clockwise order will be allowed to play until the worm is defeated or the players have no more cards they can or wish to play. The weapon card attacks will be combined in an attempt to kill the worm, but only the player who deals the final killing blow will get credit and collect either the victory point or the bounty for the worm. But as long as the worm is defeated, all players survive the combat. Regardless if the worm is killed or it simply springs forth to spray rubble and lay eggs, the token is removed from the board after the attack, and the worm card and all associated vehicle cards are discarded. A new worm card is then drawn, and the target token is moved to the coordinates on that worm card. After checking for worm attacks and resolving any combat, play then passes to the next player, who will begin their turn by playing their vehicle card. The game ends immediately as soon as any player reaches 20 points. They are the winner. Or, game end can also be triggered by any player's squad being completely eliminated. In that case, all remaining players play one additional round, and then they tally up victory points. The remaining player with the most victory points will be the winner. In the case of a tie, the player with the most bounties wins. Now let's look at some of the variants. Let's start with the 2-player variant. Setup is identical to the 3 to 5 player mode, but do not resolve any additional worm attacks beyond the initial black-bordered worms. Turns are also nearly identical, with the phases following as in the 3 to 5 player game, but there's one additional step. At the end of their turn, after checking for worm attacks, the player will roll one coordinate die. The number will indicate which worm is going to be affected during this extra step of the turn. The number corresponds to small numbers in the brown box above each of the worms in the terror zone. The first worm is a 1 to 2, the second a 3 to 4, and the third a 5 to 6. The player then draws a vehicle card and places it on the affected worm. They resolve any distractions listed on that card, but do not resolve any of the special abilities. They do not check for worm attacks. Play then passes as normal. The solo variant includes a few small changes to the setup. First, you will remove the queen cards from the worm deck. There should be 3 of these. Then you will remove any card with the /1 at the bottom in the item and weapon decks. This should have you remove from the item deck worm pheromones and stink bombs, and from the weapon deck the incubation ray, the alien snare, and the military satellite. The rest of the setup is the same, resolving only the 4 black-bordered worm attacks. In the solo game, the worms have their own turn, called the terror turn. To begin, players roll the blue die, and as in the 2-player variant, this die indicates which worm will be affected. The first worm is a 1 or a 2, the second a 3 or a 4, and the third a 5 or 6. A vehicle card is then drawn from the top of the deck and placed on the affected worm. The distractions listed on the card are applied to that worm, but the special abilities are not. You then check for worm attacks. If the card will cause the worm to reach the threshold where they attack, resolve that attack before moving on to the next stage and replace the worm at the end of the attack, whether a player was caught in it or not. Then the player rolls the red die. Regardless of whether the worm targeted by this die has enough cards to attack or not, that worm immediately attacks. The attack is resolved and the worm discarded. In the solo game, it's very important to keep up with all of your discarded worms, because at the end of the 15th worm attack, if the player has not yet won, they then lose the scenario. There are 2 other major changes to the solo mode. The first is that locations can be attacked and even destroyed. If a worm attack occurs and a location is caught in it, drop rubble on it as normal. If a second piece of rubble is ever dropped on that location before the player has time to clear it, that location will be destroyed and removed from the game. Any bounty cards in the row or that come up after that point that affect that location are discarded and replaced. The other change is that only 1 egg can be on any one grid spot on the board. If a second egg would ever be dropped into the same spot as another egg, both eggs are destroyed. Players can still carry as many eggs as wanted on their leader. 3 solo scenarios are included in the rulebook, and each has a different win condition. 1 requires you to deliver bounties to every location on the board. 1 requires you to kill every worm type, except the queen since you removed her during setup. And 1 has you racing against the clock to collect 20 points in any way you can, Some also have additional lose conditions, but as mentioned, you immediately lose if the 15th worm attack resolves. Finally, let's look at the canyon variant. The reverse side of the board includes an alternate board with a canyon in the center. Worms move through the canyon without counting any canyon spaces when resolving distraction arrows. Players, though, must ramp the canyon to move over it. Discard any vehicle card from your hand and pay 1 action point to ramp over a single space in the canyon. There is no risk to this, but also no extra reward beyond movement. To ramp more than 1 space, the player must discard a 6 or 7 from their hand, and then they must roll a die. On a 1, 2, or 3, their leader dies. On a 4, 5, or 6, the leader survives and lands successfully on the other side of the canyon. If their leader perishes, all rubble and eggs on the leader card are dropped where the leader would have landed. Either way, the player receives 1 victory point for being a daredevil. It should be noted that ramping over the canyon can only be performed in a straight line. Also, unlike when ramping player pawns, players can land in a space with rubble, and they immediately collect that rubble if they do so. And now you're ready to get Terra Below to your gaming table. If you found this how-to play video helpful, please like and subscribe below. Until next time, happy gaming!